It's time once again for Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 5 years has shared with us her extensive research into political assassinations and abuses of power in this country. Her program relates the news of the week to emerging evidence about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains by force its control over the legislative, executive, and judicial processes in America. And now, Mae Brussell.
Good afternoon. This is Mae Brussell. It's November the 8th in Carmel, California, and this is Dialogue Conspiracy number 242 for those of you that collect tapes and cassettes and can keep a record of the series. One local announcement I want to make for our area here. Up in Santa Cruz, they're having a meeting tomorrow night at the county building regarding SWAT teams. And I suggest that the local people from Carmel to Santa Cruz area attend those meetings, because if you don't like something that's happening and you make yourself visible, most of the time you can put a wedge into the process and stop it. And there is no need for SWAT teams if you want to object to them intelligently and meet them at a challenging level. Whoever gets up to speak at the meeting, it's on the first floor, that's Ocean and Walker at the county building, November the 9th. If you want to speak intelligently about them, demand the statistics of the terrorism that justifies it, and ask before they have SWAT teams in Santa Cruz that the CIA produce all evidence of the Phoenix program and Colston Westbrook, who headed a psychological research division, worked with the Phoenix program in Southeast Asia, and then came to Vacaville and formed the SLA, the Black Cultural Association, and asked for the police records of Donald DeFreeze in the Los Angeles Police Department. Just this week, I was very excited because the widows and children of the guards at San Quentin have filed a $140 million lawsuit against the Los Angeles Police Department on behalf of their families because of the testimony of Louis Tackwood that he worked for the Los Angeles Police Department, that they were involved in the shootout the day that George Jackson was killed, and that they planned the shootout, and that these guards were innocent victims of the planning of the Los Angeles Police Department. Now, this is the first time that families, guards from white America, have sued other police officials, such as the Los Angeles Police Department. They've usually stayed pretty close together as buddies and would never, years ago, believe a black man such as Louis Tackwood. But the times are now changing, and the families want to see the papers, and they want to put Ed Davis, the chief of police in Los Angeles, and Evel Young, the attorney, on the defensive. And I think that the same people that form the SWAT teams that want a Gestapo in the United States, that want Camp Roberts opened up to train the National Guard, which they were doing this last year and probably doing it now, and want these rifles on our streets. These people have created the violence so that they can create the excuse for the soldiers for a takeover in the United States eventually, when there is not enough opportunity for jobs or housing or food. And these SWAT teams are created out of an artificial situation, just like the LEAA was formed after Martin Luther King was killed. And just before I went on the air, I was reading a report of what a total failure the LEAA was. It didn't stop crime. It only brought electronic equipment to survey and wiretap people in the United States from 1968 to 1976, and it hasn't stopped with all of its billions of dollars, one bit of the criminal process that's been going on. So if you want to argue SWAT teams and you get a chance to get up there, speak in your community or any other community. They were put into Davis last year when I was up there speaking, and the people on the campus objected to the SWAT teams there. I think that you should demand the figures of what justifies the SWAT teams, and even if they go into the violence in Santa Cruz, you can bring up the Kemper trial, the Frazier and the Mullen and the suppressed evidence and the links of these people with the intelligence community, particularly over in Hawaii, where some of these men were escorted, and they've been doing a lot of mind control and behavior modification over there. So if you want to stop the SWAT teams, demand the justification for it and challenge the origin of the SWAT teams, and particularly what they did in Los Angeles by killing all the SLA without any warning. And we would have known which ones were military agents, possibly, if they had lived and they killed these people. So stop them wherever you can. And tomorrow night in Santa Cruz, go to the meeting and say you want the facts and figures just on Mr. Westbrook and Donald DeFreeze. There are links to the FBI and CIA, and that there should be SWAT teams in your community until you get that solved. I want to speak for a few minutes about a trial, a brief trial. It took about 20 minutes, and it has to do with somebody that interested me, and I talked about him several times on KLRB. That was Michael Vladimir Abkalitz. He calls his name Mr. Abkalitz. The spelling that caught my interest at first was that Aabcalxyz, and I knew that was a code name. And I'm beginning to wonder if Nazi Germany, they put a number on a person's arm and gave them numbers. Is it possible to give somebody an alphabet that they remember? Is this similar to a number if he's mentally programmed and he calls himself by this name? And there is no such person. It reminds me of the town Los Angeles called Azusa. They used to say it was A to Z and USA in the middle. Well, Mr. Abkalitz had a Cal in the middle, which made me know immediately that he was from out of state for whatever he was doing. And then it turned out that he did have another name, Robert Allen Violet, and he was charged with murdering a woman at the Hunter Liggett military base, which is a place for laser beam experimentations and weapon systems in our Monterey County area. And Mr. Abkalitz admitted, or they found out he was Mr. Violet by some markings on his body, and he had a temporary hearing. It was a hearing up in San Jose. And the very first one that he had when the thing was moved up there was in a federal court and not in Salinas. And Charlie Bates from the FBI was handling the case, according to the newspapers. And at the hearings up there, the first recommendation was that the charges be dropped on the basis that he didn't have a speedy hearing. And this was just within 1 month of the time that this woman's neck was broken. So that sounded a little funny. She jumped out of a car, and her head hit a guardrail, and her neck was broken, and she died. Well, at the trial, Mr. Violet, Robert Allen Violet, who also has a third personality, spoke up just for a little while last week, and he does have double personality, and the judge admitted it. He has maybe 3 personalities. He has 2 names and possibly third. And his defense, of course, is that one of his persons, the Violet, one was good, and Mr. Abkalitz was in back of the car. One did the hitting of this woman, and there was a flashlight in the car with a lead base. And the gist of the trial, it went so fast, and the opinion I got was that the man had left, this can be verified, he left a jail in South Dakota. He had murdered another person there. He'd come out to California and ended up at an Army base or outside of it with a woman who then was killed, and they were going to let him off completely free until I had called KGO, and I think then they had called Evel Young or the FBI across the street from where they were, and a light charge was placed, and he got sentenced to 3 years running concurrently with his past escape from South Dakota. Now, the logic of the court in his sentencing was that because she got out of the car on her own, and her head hit the railing, he wasn't really responsible for her death because she jumped out of the car. Instead of giving the interpretation that she jumped out of the car because the interior was all full of blood and her only chance of living was to get out of the car, his sentence was reduced to 3 years. So at first it didn't seem that he'd have any sentence, and then it was dropped to 3 years. Then the courts, the prosecution or the defense or whatever, never went into her background of what she was doing on the base, where she came from. If it was not a cold-blooded murder, was there a motive? How long did he know her? None of her family were at the trial. They live in New Jersey. He has an ex-wife in San Francisco and family down near Hunter Liggett. No family seemed to be at any of the hearings. He's just like a non-person with 3 personalities. And what came up at the case was that this particular woman had once shot herself with a rifle, and at another time she took some pills, and therefore I suppose you come to the conclusion, the logic of the court in giving him a light sentence is that being as she was a loser anyway and was going to die, there's no use his paying for it. But you have to know that she must be the greatest psychic in the world, trying to commit suicide twice and losing, that she happens to hitch a ride with a known killer, and he does it for her. The logic is off. The sentence was light. The triple personality is what interests me, because the man obviously still doesn't know who he is, and he did say at court that he was satisfied that he said everybody's trying to be helpful to me, and he had his head shaved since the last hearing and some sodium pentothal. And Mr. Abklitz will be in the federal penitentiary here at McNeil Island probably for 3 years, and then he'll be out on the streets again. And we never will know anything about this woman or why he killed her or if he was programmed to do it or if he's a test case on the case. But it ends there for temporarily, and I'm sure that we haven't heard the end of this man. Even if it's 4 or 5 years from now, his name will probably surface in the news one more time. Well, the elections are over. I'm not going to say too much about the elections or my feelings about it. I want to make a few comments about the news immediately afterwards, and you can see my line of thinking. The first impression I got of Gerald Ford is that he was physically and psychologically sick. I don't think his throat hurt him as badly as he proclaimed because he was talking when he acknowledged that his wife and family had been helpful. But he looked like a man who was visibly shaken, and I don't think the losing was a shaking. My interpretation is he announced that he was going to Palm Springs. And I think that that would be one reason to be very nervous, because Palm Springs is not Ford territory. That is known as Reagan territory, or John Connally, or Mr. Annenberg, or Paul Lasalle. And the very powerful team that really controls this country, the people behind the wheels, representing the youth organization or William Simon, there's a clique of a very small group that are holding on, that inherited the mess from the Cold War and World War II that I'm going into in detail in a moment. And Ford was told, I'm sure, go to Palm Springs. He usually goes to Colorado, and I think that his meetings there are terribly important, who he sees, because the biggest powers of this country will be down there retrenching what to do about the winning of Jimmy Carter. The next article that I noticed that goes along with this is the reorganizing of the GOP by Jack Anderson today, that Ronald Reagan is far from through. Ronald Reagan said, we came out of Kansas City with 3,000 trained workers intact, and starting in December and January, they're going to set up meetings. And they'll set up one meeting in Phoenix, Arizona, and then in the South. And as Jack Anderson said today, you can count on it, Ronald Reagan will be an activist. I don't believe for a moment that Ronald Reagan is anything but a front, similar to Adolf Hitler or Richard Nixon, and he will go full speed and try for that White House. The Reagan people put in Hayakawa at 70 years old. They made a big scene of that, and I think because of Reagan's years, he'll be 65 years old, that they're playing up that it's in the prime of life that this old man should be in the Senate now. You're going to see a lot of publicity and articles on Hayakawa, the aged, ripe old man in there, and that will make way for Ronald Reagan. The people that want Ronald Reagan in the White House spent a great fortune getting Hayakawa in there instead of young, a virile person, and I think it sets the example, because Hayakawa had absolutely no qualifications for being a U.S. Senator, but his age is a rallying point, and Ronald Reagan will use it, and Hayakawa will be there as an example. Another thing that's important is that Richard Helms was told to come home from Iran this week. The day of the elections, the newspapers ran an article that Richard Helms is coming home from Iran. Now, if there were to be any manipulation between now and the time that Jimmy Carter gets the inaugural, it is a very dangerous time. As a matter of fact, the Secret Service came down to my house. They called me, and they were down at the house this last Wednesday, and I took a tape recording of my conversation with them, so I would have a copy, and I made a copy to send to Jimmy Carter, and I called down there. And I had advised that Jimmy Carter does not leave the country between now and when he takes the oath of office, because he mentioned that he might take a trip to St. Croix or the Virgin Islands or down that area in the Bahamas. And if he leaves this country, he's vulnerable, because after the CIA blew up that airplane of Castro's with 74 people on it, and certain people that have been arrested are telling of their involvement with the intelligence community, it would be very easy to take a Cuban who is brainwashed or who's acting as a Cuban representing Castro, who is actually a spy, and kill Jimmy Carter over those waters, and then say, well, we didn't know it was Carter's plane and it's vengeance for blowing up the Cuban plane. You kill a lot of birds with one stone, and once you've studied the script of many of these plots, it would be very easy to do. And I was very happy to learn, I read in the paper this morning, as a matter of fact, that Jimmy Carter has no intention of leaving the country till after the inauguration. And I had called to Georgia and told the Secret Service I didn't think he should leave Georgia. Stay where he knows the people, the friendly territory, and don't go out of Georgia till he takes the oath of office. I did forget to ask the Secret Service, the subject came up when I came in at KLRB today, about the line of succession between the nomination of a person and when they win the election and before they take the oath of office. I'll give some of you a research job, and you can write me a letter to the House. My address is in the book. Or telephone me and see if you can find any provision in the Constitution. And if not, ask your teachers and find out. I haven't looked it up, but I don't know if there's a provision in the Constitution if a man who has been elected and hasn't taken oath of office is killed, do you have other elections and who becomes president? That's a question I meant to ask the Secret Service and I didn't. But Jimmy Carter has to stay in Georgia. That is mandatory. And the only person who could help swing this thing, if it were going to happen, would be Richard Helms, because his name comes through every piece of illegal activity. He was a protege of Allen Dulles and was in Germany, met Hitler during World War, just prior to World War II. And Richard Helms is the person who could swing it. I have just one article here on Richard Helms from the Washington Post in at the time of the Watergate hearings, and it had to do with Chile and the killing of Allende and the campaign against Salvador Allende down in Chile. And Mr. Edwards, a newspaper man from Chile, had been in Washington, D.C. as a publisher by the name of Augustine Edwards. He met Richard Helms, and after that, Mr. Helms went to see Richard Nixon, and that's when the CIA began to get involved in the military coup d'etat down in Chile. And there's a note of Helms, a handwritten note, this is from the Washington Post, from this meeting that reflected that the presidential reactions and instructions were these: we have a 1 in 10 chance, perhaps, but save Chile, not concerned with the risks involved. The risks involved, of course, had to go to the killing of Allende. But the president and Richard Helms, President Nixon, Richard Helms, the CIA, were involved in the overthrow of Allende and in Chile. And as soon as the new government was put in, Mr. Pinochet down in Chile, the Nazi flags came out, the swastikas, the armbands, and they began to get excited about the new government. Just in September of 1975, there was a ruling put out by the military junta in Chile that they will not change hands for an entire generation, that they don't intend to change the rule of Chile, that they'll be in power for one entire generation or 100 years. That was the proclamation as soon as Allende was killed. And the CIA put this in. They said that we don't want any polarization, no democratic government. And this is what Richard Helms helped with his expertise in the CIA. And Mr. Helms was very much in part of the mind control operations in this country, the assassinations, the covering up of the assassinations. And I think that his coming home at this time is a very important thing to watch. I gave all of this to the Secret Service. I said, with Gerald Ford down in Palm Springs this week, down there now, for right away off the bat, he said he'd be down there 10 days, which is a long time for the President of the United States, who's been campaigning and interrupted, to leave at this transition period to go down to Palm Springs. And I analyze this as a high summit meeting of all the powers that be that I've ever researched in terms of these various conspiracies. And Mr. Ford must have been ordered down there. I'm sure he was ordered down there. Just it's identical to the meeting at the home of Clint Murchison the night before John Kennedy was killed. And I told this to the Secret Service. I said where J. Edgar Hoover was and where Richard Nixon was. This has to be a retrenchment of the Reagan California team, because California selects the candidates. They don't lose to somebody like Jimmy Carter in Georgia, even though he would go along with a lot of the things that they want. And Richard Helms gave his resignation, and he's coming home, and he's going to be needed. He has an expertise in this field. He's the last one, he and William Colby, that could pull this off. So that Richard Helms has to be watched from the time he sets foot back in the United States, and John Connally and Ronald Reagan have to be watched, and Gerald Ford's meetings with these people at least until Jimmy Carter takes the oath of office. And once he takes the oath of office, I think he'll be safe there because this team will not be able to control Mr. Mondale, Vice President Mondale. I don't think they'll want him in. He's too liberal for what they want, and I don't think they can swing it. So if we see the government hold its own up through the inauguration, I think that you'll see changes in this government in the next 4 years. But there's a lot of power, and there are a lot of weapons, and there's a lot of people running around. You call them nuts. I don't think they're that nuts. In Waco, Texas, this week, the authorities held a man, 59-year-old man, on $25,000 bond who was threatening to murder Jimmy Carter. So it's starting already, and it's coming out of Texas. It'll be Texas, California, Georgia, or Florida. Those are the centers of a lot of this brainwashing, and a man from Texas is being held now. Carter took a flight on his first presidential airplane. He liked it. He claimed he liked the luxury of it, but it was a historic plane. It's the plane on which John Kennedy was sworn in as President of the United States. And then, of course, that tells you in the next sentence, it's also the plane that brought the body of President John Kennedy back to Washington from Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. It's been doctored up and painted with pictures of Gerald Ford and his wife to make it attractive. But that is the historic plane that Jimmy Carter is assigned until the inauguration. If there's any karma in that, you can draw your own conclusions. And that's what he's flying around in. And they've assigned this particular one to him. I'm glad the plane is still being used. They destroyed the car that John Kennedy was in, but the plane is intact, and that's Jimmy Carter's plane. Well, last week on Dialogue Conspiracy, I talked about a book with my friend Lydia Blades. It's called The File on the Tsar by Anthony Summers and Tom Mangold. This subject is one that is of fascination to me because of my research into the John Kennedy assassination, and also because I guess it's the bottom line in putting together the puzzles of all the conspiracies I've studied since World War II, or the rearming of Germany after World War I. The Alger Hiss conspiracy, the Rosenbergs, the Chicago conspiracy trial, the San Quentin shootout, the Patty Hearst case, many cases that I've studied, that I've seen relationships to historic events, all go back to the overthrow of the government when the Tsar's family was kicked out and the Bolsheviks and the communists took over. And I'm interested in that book on the File on the Tsar because the more I study the rise of Germany and World War II and Hitler, the more it makes sense, as we mentioned last week, of putting Adolf Hitler into power to go back and get the throne for the German princess who was removed and who, according to this book, was alive and her daughters were alive. And if Hitler had won World War II, the Germans then would take control of Russia and put the Russians in the hand of the monarchy again. Now, Hitler had to be in some way controlled. I've studied quite a few years now the psychology of these so-called freaks, these dictators, this goose-stepping, arm-bending man with a lot of charisma. He has to be controlled in some way psychologically to build up the opinion of himself against all logic in the world without any education. He becomes the darling of the munition makers and the DuPonts and the Mellons and the Rockefellers and U.S. Steel and General Motors and ITT and Charles Lindbergh. Adolf Hitler is the dream for what they want, to go in and attack Russia. He is their front. And yet he really isn't that smart. And how did they choose him? How did they take this man without any background, fairly crude, and paint him up and send him out to conquer and do their work for them? The answer is in several books on the choice of Hitler and what happened after World War I. One is in Reinhard Gehlen's Spy of the Century, and the other one is in the Bormann Brotherhood. But a new book came out. I'll talk about those two in conjunction to a new book which came out just in the last 2 weeks, which should be as interesting as the book The File on the Tsar, and it's called Adolf Hitler by John Toland. And there's just a couple of pages in that book that are applicable to what I feel happened to Adolf Hitler And it happened to Richard Nixon, and it happens to Ronald Reagan, and it happened to Howard Hughes. And I think these people have been the continuous front of the military-industrial. They've been the front men, and they have been psychologically controlled to keep these wars going and to keep the munitions going, the armaments contracts going, and the war scare. These men were the front, and in some way, each of them was manipulated, just as Ronald Reagan, the actor, had to be manipulated into this role that he wants to conquer and take over, retrench, and to still take on the United States as his territory. Well, Hitler was depressed during World War I. He was gassed, or he thought he was gassed. He was in a hospital with pain, and he lost his sight. But he thought he was blind, but he wasn't blind. And in the book, this new book on Adolf Hitler, in the prologue, it tells the story of how he was mentally unstable. There was a diagnosis of the psychiatrist that Adolf Hitler was mentally unstable and depressed. And when he lost his sight, his eyelids were closed. He was listening to talk around the hospital about the German defeat, and he was embarrassed. And there were some Jewish people there that hadn't fought in the war, and his anti-Semitism was blossoming in the hospital. And they got a special psychiatrist for him because he was mentally unstable. And the psychiatrist's name is Professor Edmund Forster, Forster, the chief of the Berlin University Nerve Clinic. And Dr. Forster made a marvelous recovery for Adolf Hitler. At this nerve clinic, he wasn't suffering from what they thought he was. He had an unexplained recovery. And the diagnosis of Hitler was hysteria. This was what the doctors decided. And in the hospital, he developed this terrible hatred of Bolshevism, and he probably was hysterical on the front firing lines and was blaming somebody for his condition, his eyes, and he blamed the Bolsheviks, even though Germany was the one that was instigating this world war. And so in the hospital, after his eyesight was cured, or while it was cured, this Dr. Foster treated him. And this book alleges that Foster made the initial conclusion, not only that he was definitely a psychopath with hysterical symptoms, but that he could be programmed, that he could be deliberately induced. He could hear voices like St. Joan. He was told to save Germany. He made decisions at that time. It was in the hospital under the control of Dr. Foster that he made the decision to become a politician and be like Joan of Arc and to save Germany. And his intense dislike of that war and the enemy that he built up around him were used, probably suggested in this book, by this doctor from the psychiatric clinic at Berlin University, and that Hitler was told that he could do these things. Now, this is important because Donald de Vries was told at Vacaville that he could be a leader, that he could replace Martin Luther King, that he could replace Malcolm X. Well, those men were dead. Well, how did Donald de Vries figure he was going to do it? He worked with the Los Angeles Police Department and with the FBI. But he was told he'd have this great leadership and he'd have this army and that he'd be a great leader of the black people. And he was taken out of Soledad and Vacaville and out on the streets in Berkeley with these white people. And he had the illusion, totally out of contact with reality. He sat around the house in Los Angeles just before the shootout, and he laid guns on the floor and told people to come in and out, and told them he was a leader. Never dawned on him they would look for him because of the murder of Dr. Foster up in the Bay Area, or the kidnapping of Patty Hearst. He was wanted for the bank robbery. They were wanted for that. He was photographed there. But he sat in the middle of the floor, and he attached his belt with his guns, and he asked people if they wanted to join his army. And they had vans there, and they didn't drive away, and they depended on their food and drink for a drugstore down at the corner. Donald de Vries was always acting out of contact with reality, and no black army at all behind him of any kind, and he believed he had it. And it's that kind of mind control where people can be used. And so Adolf Hitler was hearing voices, and they could take somebody legitimately into a situation where they've been damaged by the enemy, such as Hitler's in a hospital. He thinks the tear gas has bothered him. He's a natural. If you read the book, The Smith Conspiracy, they took a man in Vietnam who they showed war movies of the protesters at home, and then his friends were blown up on a mine, and then they'd show him the Chicago conspiracy trial. They'd say, look at these people at home, they're anti-Vietnam, and your best friend's being blown up. And they could take this particular person in the book and program them to hate the people at home and come home and kill civil rights leaders and anti-war protesters because they were taught who their enemy were. And Hitler's mind control experiments in LSD and drugs was so sophisticated that we brought it to this country in 1947, the minute the war was over. And so here you have Hitler at this hospital, hearing voices, being told he could save Germany, and making the decision to be a politician. Now, there's another book on the subject called The Eyewitness, a Soldier by Ernest Weiss that's mentioned in this book. And this book also suggests that Hitler was induced through hallucinations and hypnotic suggestions to be what he did turn out to be. Now, it's one thing to have the illusion, but then he had all the financial support of the Western world. And when you read the book Reinhardt's Galen, it's called The Spy of the Century by Mr. Cookridge, you see that at the end of World War I, the military intelligence decided immediately that they would rearm and get ready for World War II. And they built this secret government with people like Martin Bormann, who were the genius behind Adolf Hitler. Martin Bormann was the man who designed Adolf Hitler just like the used people designed Richard Nixon and manipulated him and put babysitters around him. And so Reinhard Galen became the chief of whole Eastern Division, which was the Soviet territory, getting spies and counter-spies set up for their eventual takeover of Germany. And when they didn't succeed, and Galen didn't succeed, then he was meeting with Allen Dulles over in Switzerland in 1944-45, and then flown to the Pentagon, even flown once out to Monterey to the spy school. And Reinhard Galen's plan to rearm Germany began before Hitler even was consciously a big force there. While they decided they would rearm Germany, the powers that be, illegally against the Versailles Treaty, there was a psychiatrist with a mentally unstable person in the hospital in Germany, and he could hypnotically suggest to him that he would be a great leader. So on the one hand, you have a spy system building up in Germany immediately after World War I, getting ready to attack Russia and get the German princess avenged and get that family back on the throne. And then you have a man selected by a doctor from this Berlin University that will be the leader for that spy system, just as certainly as in 1945 when Richard Nixon was flown to California, a bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel to meet Howard Hughes. And then it's no coincidence that he is sitting on the throne illegally bombing Cambodia and Laos and falsifying evidence to have a war in Southeast Asia. If you study the history of America from 45 up through 71, 72, it's no different than Germany in 1914, 15, up to 1933. The same people were arranging the manipulation of Hitler as a front for Reinhard Galen and the spy system that was evolving there. And then when World War II was over, Allen Dulles, who represented the same people that used Hitler as their front, brought to this country under Project Paperclip the scientists that would do the mind controlling over this country and the behavior modification. In 1947, Allen Dulles brought to this country Nazi German scientists that had been working on mind control for many, many years in Germany and set them up. And the CIA documents just released by the Rockefeller Report and the new Senate, their old Senate hearings in end of 1975, but they've been published now and they're available, show the chronology of the CIA mind control program for political use. So in 1947, began the program on the altering of human behavior. And next week on Dialogue Conspiracy, I think I'll do an entire program on the systematic importation of the Nazis into this country and the use of mind control for the political assassinations. Because the people involved here, like first Allen Dulles and then Richard Helms, are still actively affecting our lives. And we have selected front people, and I believe very strongly that Richard Nixon, when his time was up, Ronald Reagan was to replace him. And that's why, studying these documents and these people, I wonder about the meeting in Palm Springs this week, that'll be going on for 10 days of Gerald Ford. Now, the mind control program, just a little background of how it moved into this country from Germany in 1947, then I'll go into the details of the methods they used, the drugs they used, and where the contracts went out, because I think you'll find that interesting. I got it from the Pentagon, a researcher got it for me. But early in Germany, they were studying the altering of the third mind and the application of drugs to the mind. And by 1930, the Nazi doctors were quite efficient at altering human behavior and preparing people for the good soldiers that they were going to be. That was in 1930, and by then, Adolf Hitler was pretty much into winning the election. By 1933, he had won an election like Nixon had won an election over here, but he was very much under their control from the ending of World War I. In 1948, the CIA had been working a year on altering human behavior, and then by 1953, they went into hypnosis and injecting fluids and erasing memory and creating doubles. And with this, you can do just about any political assassination or overthrow the government, because people like Mr. Abkolitz that I mentioned earlier can be tested and murder people and not know who did it. He doesn't even know. He tells the court and believes it, that one person, who's one part of him, was sitting in the front seat and another part was in back. And he has no memory of the murder at all, which is a typical result of CIA testing, which they became very expertise at. It was testing to erase the memory and giving double and triple personalities, and he's a classical case. Then by 1953 to 63, the CIA had perfected all the different tests on drugs and chemicals and LSD. And by 1963, they were working in California. Aldous Huxley had control of the California beatnik population and was recommending his psychedelic manifesto, and Timothy Leary back east was pushing drugs. And now that I see the role that Timothy Leary is playing with the space program and NASA, and realizing how damaging he was to any political movements in the 50s, 60s, his little tricks out of Harvard or the LSD, I can believe more and more that Timothy Leary has direct inroads to the intelligence community and was very useful through his little trips to neutralize many, many people. Because what he called LSD and what the CIA made were two different projects, but he was telling everybody to turn on. So when they turned on, maybe two-thirds were getting what Timothy Leary was getting, and one-third were getting the CIA poisons, enough to discredit a whole generation and wipe out their brains. So Timothy Leary was useful, and so was Ken Kesey. He was encouraging everybody to take acid and go on their cool acid trip, and the truth was that some acid was okay for some people, and other acid was made by government laboratories and definitely had poison in it. So it wasn't the same kind of acid that everybody was getting any more than the same kind of cigarettes or marijuana that people get. Some is laced with poison. Philip Agee talks about cigarettes the CIA made that collapsed lungs. And I talk about that often because you think these things are safe. They're not necessarily. They're not necessarily dangerous. But the use of the drug program was important, and it was important later for the violences, which we had in California. All the many violences of the kidnappings and the scene that brings on the SWAT team, the excuse for them, people like Mr. Kemper, Edmund Kemper, John Frazier, and Herbert Mullen, that brought a pocket of violences to the California Santa Cruz area, and Charlie Manson's violence down in Los Angeles, and the Altamont concert where people were handing out thousands of tablets of LSD with poison that came from a specific Berkeley laboratory. I think that the excuse for the computerized police, for the law enforcement flexing their muscles for getting more budgets and electronic data banks, was a lot of violence, and the violence was directly related to using the brains of those people who had no control over their own lives. And then later they could be put into prison, and they still can't remember how they were used, and they can't know if the very first person that introduced them to this road to violence did it while they were under the influence of this poison. In 1942, Albert Hoffman, a chemist, he worked for Sandoz Company over in Europe in Basel, Switzerland, which was the headquarters, to become the headquarters of Allen Dulles of the CIA. and he was closely associated, this chemist Albert Hoffman, with I.G. Garvey, chemical cartel from Nazi Germany. And Alan Dulles, who represented Standard Oil and that became the director of the CIA. He was a lawyer for the Standard Oil people and then became a director of the CIA. And he worked near Bern, Switzerland. And in 1953, as I say, till 63, he supervised with Richard Helms' highly secret use of chemicals. Richard Helms and Alan Dulles had 100 million doses of LSD. At that time, they purchased for 1/2 the population of the United States. And the doors of perception, as I say, that Aldous Huxley wrote, was to encourage people to take this and test it as a weapon. Now, we hear a lot about weapon systems, about the MERS and the B-1 bombers and the various atomic weapons that are being manufactured or deployed, but there's never been an assault against the weapons of the mind. And it's one of the most important areas that has not yet broken through the consciousness of the news media. The Congress published reports on these subjects, and the headlines one day had a little bit about MK Ultra program and the poison dart guns or the poison on the tip of a pen, but most of it went unnoticed, just like an FBI report that I just read a few minutes before I went on the air. It was in Crawdaddy, an article by Ed Sanders on the Manson family. But in it mentions the fact that the FBI had a chemical to start a bacteriological war on the Black Panthers, caused diarrhea and vomiting and so forth in New Jersey, I believe. And the crime they were doing is that they had a school lunch program for little black children. And the only reason they claimed they stopped the program of poisoning was because it might affect people, federal agents at the post office. But the minds of people can also be poisoned through food and beverages. And the weapon, the most potent weapon, I think, in this age, it has been hypnosis and drugs. You see, a person like Adolf Hitler, who can be hypnotized and given illusions, can be responsible for the death of 80 million people. It seems to me that hypnosis, I don't know if it'll ever be outlawed, like they try to stop weapons or guns or gun control. I don't know if there'll ever be a death penalty for people who hypnotically have induced somebody to commit crimes or to give them acid that causes them to be violent and freak out and kill themselves or have their hearts explode and pull their hair out. I read about the drugs and I read about the manipulation, say, of someone like Adolf Hitler, who can be told you're going to go into Russia and free the Russians or get them back on the throne, and he can believe it. And then when you read that book, The File on the Tsar, and you believe those people are still alive, and where did they go? And again, it goes back to the cycle of my work on John Kennedy's assassination, because I believe a large pocket of them are in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and not separated from Marina Oswald. And the Russian, in the Minsk radio factory where Lee Harvey Oswald worked, there was this Mr. Zeiger, who was in Europe, Eastern Europe, at the time of World War II, and went to Argentina and came back, and then met with Marina Oswald and introduced her to Lee Harvey Oswald. The story of the Tsar, or Marina's possible relationship to the Tsar's family, because she definitely was aristocracy, is a subject that I'll be bringing up many, many times on Dialogue Conspiracy, because the inducement of Hitler to go to Russia to avenge, get the Tsar's family back in power, or using these people in Dallas, Texas at the time of the Kennedy assassination, begins to put in all of the missing pieces of these various conspiracies that I've studied for the last 13 years. And that's a good feeling. Well, our time is up on Dialogue Conspiracy. I will talk, hopefully next week, on mind control and government operations. And I'll see you next week at 5:15 in Carmel, California. It's Mae Brussell. Goodbye.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for many years has been researching the facts behind political assassinations and conspiracies in this country. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB FM in Carmel, California.